Hi, everyone. It's Margaret Manning here with lifeafterdeath.com. Lifeafterdeath.com is a community of people who are fascinated by the topic of life after death, reincarnation, near-death experience, and spirituality in general. You know, we ask questions, we talk to experts who can enlighten us on aspects of this conversation. Now, my guest today is Philip Almond. Philip is a retired professor of the history of religious thought at Queensland University in Australia, and he's had a passion for the topic of religion since he was 17 years old. He has written 3 books, or I think maybe even more, on the subject of life after death and spirituality and the history of our thinking about religion. And he has also written a book that's a God, a biography, the Devil, a biography, and he's working on a new one on the Antichrist. So this is a man who's taking this subject very seriously. So welcome, Philip.
Hello, Margaret. Thanks.
It's really lovely to have you here. We've got lots of questions. As you know, Philip, we had a couple of chats about the evolution of how we have thought about the afterlife and about spirituality, why we are concerned about life after death. But I wanted to change the topic a little and talk about your analysis, your research about the history of how we think about God and how we think about the opposite, about the devil. So start where you like here, and then we'll go from there. But how do you notice some changes? How have things changed?
Well, I think one thing we do often forget with respect to a notion like the devil or a notion like God, ideas like that have histories, and I think we often assume that how people think of God in the 21st century is more or less how people have always thought of God or the devil. Mm-hmm. And that's not true. These things have long, complicated, complex, and often quite contradictory histories. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the main thrust of the work I try to do is to get people to recognise that these concepts have a history, and that therefore their modern thinking about such ideas is historically located and has changed and evolved for good and ill in all sorts of different ways.
So we look at this. I mean, for example, Joseph Campbell is one of my heroes in terms of what he's written about mythology, and maybe that's where a lot of these ideas of God and the devil are fueled by the way we've talked about them in our stories.
Yes, it's really difficult. Yes, it's really difficult to talk about the evolution of religious ideas because we just don't have the kind of data that goes to that. Yeah. Where we can start to nail down the development of ideas about God or the devil is really when we have textual traditions to work on.
Right.
My work has been really around trying to spin off the textual traditions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam in particular around these ideas.
Well, what's interesting to me is that the myths actually often do talk about gods in a more personal way. They try to bring it down to the qualities of that we're confronted with in our lives every day. Is that where the thinking about God started, or was it the other way, where there was like, why is this world here, and more of a creator? Where does it start?
No, I think it began with those earlier ideas about that there was a transcendent realm, and that it was heavily populated with gods and goddesses, and the way they lived their lives was pretty much like a transcendent version of the way we live our lives. So, we think of the polytheistic traditions of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, ancient Greece in particular, I suppose, where there are gods in all sorts of directions. They're not particularly ethically orientated. They really behave just as well and just as badly as we do. And then I think, if something does evolve, we can probably say something like this, that both within the Greek tradition, but more particularly within the biblical tradition, we start to get the trimming down of the multiplicity of gods to the notion that whether there are many gods or no other gods at all, there's either a superior God who's in control of all the others, or really, as we get eventually in the Christian and Judaic and Islamic traditions, there's really only one God and that's all there is. And then once we've got that into play, we can start to get into serious notions about the God as creator, and there was nothing, there was nothing but God, and then suddenly he created the world and so on. So when you can talk about evolution, we can go down that path.
No, but when you think about those early myths, I mean, these gods were crazy. I mean, they were not perfect. They were actually misbehaving. I mean, in fact, like Joseph Campbell talks about, I think Dionysius and Apollo, I think he talks about how they're really the two sides of one person. They're like the crazy, wild, pleasure-loving, and then the more organized and structured. And I guess you can only run a culture for so long with that kind of dichotomy before it starts getting a little bit out of control, and you get some real place. Old Testament comes along.
So they're like projections of us at our best and our worst. If there's a projection theory of religion has any sense at all, that the gods are nothing but projections of us. The Greek gods look pretty close to fitting a projection theory of religion, that they're really the heavens are populated with the best and worst of our imaginings.
Well, okay, we're talking about God, and God is, of course, there's nothing about that word too. You say it, and there's something about the word that's powerful. Is that when you think about the opposite. Now, I have, like I've told you, I have a degree in comparative religion myself, and way back, I remember the Zoroastrians with Ahura Mazda and somebody else, and there was like good and evil, and the whole point of that religion was you chose. Do you on the side of good or the bad side? And so that was to me where the devil or the evil side took a stand and said, choose. Is that where you would start your thinking about it? And tell us about the devil.
Well, within the Western tradition, there's I say this often, it looks like there's a contradiction and there's a problem. On the one hand, the devil within the Western religions, within Christianity in particular, where he plays a really, really major role. He's the number 2 player in this whole gig. Within the Christian tradition, he looks on the one hand like he does God's work. He's God's emissary. He's the one who God sends to punish people. So God's in total control of the devil. And so therefore any evil that the devil does at the end of the day is really shooted back to God as his responsibility. One part of the Christian tradition. And we think of the book of Job, where the devil says to God, that Job, I don't think his faith's as strong as you think it is. Let me go down and make his life a complete misery and see then if he keeps believing in you. God sends him off. On the other side, there's a tradition within Christianity, and it's coming out of the Zarathustrian origins, that the world is not controlled by a force for good, namely God. The world as we see it is a battleground between two gods, a God of good and a God of evil. So we have on the one hand a Christian tradition of monotheism with the devil as a major player, but he's God's worker. And on the other hand, the dualist tradition of two opposing forces battling it out through the history of the world until the end of time, when God will eventually defeat the devil.
So what happened?
Those two ideas work together.
Yeah. So what happened there, Philip? I mean, is it like you said that earlier that we can't really talk about evolution until we have text we can read? But what do you think influenced that in the world? That change
between
the devil as being kind of a helper of God. I mean, even in the in the New, like you said, in the Bible, you can see that possibility. Yes. But how he then became more evil, more independent, like willful. Even with Job, you said that was nasty of him to say, no, let me go down and test him, and that was not nice.
Yes, I think it comes as a consequence of Greek philosophy coming into the Christian tradition. Now, the consequence of Greek philosophy, and particularly Platonic philosophy coming into the Greek tradition, goes this. Plato sees the ultimate transcendent as being good in itself, perfectly good. So there's no place within the Platonic tradition for any evil in God. And the Platonic good becomes identified with the God of the Christians in around, we'll say, about AD 200. So from that moment, when the Christian God becomes essentially and perfectly good in himself, then we can no longer really have a God who sends dirty work. The devil now has to attain some kind of independent existence and becomes a kind of powerful, more or less powerful enemy of the divine. And at about the same time, crucially, at about the same time, within the Christian tradition, the devil gets read back into the original biblical story in Genesis of the fall of Adam and Eve. We all know the story. It's a snake that tempts Eve. She then tempts Adam and they're thrown out of the garden. But it's only in about AD 200 that the Christian tradition says, guess who the snake was? It's the devil. So the devil now becomes built in the Christian tradition as an opposing force, opposing God's desires and bringing about the fall of Adam and Eve way back when. So the devil then, from that moment on, from about 200 AD, the devil is this key oppositional force to this perfectly good God and the key explanation for the fall of man.
So you've written several books on this topic. You wrote a book on the devil, a biography, and God, a biography, controversial titles. And you mentioned that there's more attraction to the book on the devil. Why do you think that is?
Well, simply put, I think simply put, people think they know about God. They think, well, that's pretty simple, nothing complicated there. So what I do try to do in the book is really show this is really pretty complicated and messy and much more interesting than you might think.
Yes.
People have a much better sense about the devil than they do about God. I mean, people don't rush along to watch films called God, but they'll rush along to watch a film called The Exorcist. It's much more, what?
Interesting.
Intriguing. It's frightening.
Well, that goes back to that reflection thing, though. Is it more that you see yourself, your own flaws? I mean, who hasn't done something that they are sorry for in their life, that they've hurt someone or they've stolen something or that they've whatever, they've done something, quotes, bad, and maybe just like, hey, he's done it too. Like, is there that kind of making yourself feel better?
Well, I think it is partly so. I mean, there's always a sense with committing evil that's not really me. So in some senses, the devil provides something pretty close to us who can function as an explanation of evil. I always remember once when I was a very small boy, probably about 6, I was being tormented by a swear word. And I said to my mother, this is terrible, I feel awful. Swear word keeps going through my mind. She said, just ignore it. It's just the devil tempting you. I felt much better as a result.
See, it's like he does it. It's it's not so bad.
It's not me. It's not me.
It's him.
Yeah,
well, okay, so we've talked in a couple other interviews about life after death. So what about the devil? What role does he play after death? Because in a way, it's kind of funny. He's in control of hell. I mean, does he greet you if you go in the certain traditions, of course? But it's almost like he's punishing you in some way, which is, you wouldn't think he would mind doing that.
Yes. Well, the devil is God's punisher. So in the afterlife, whether immediately after death or at the end of the world, the devil is located in a place where you can be punished. So the devil and his demons are essentially the punishers of the wicked in hell. But they are also at the same time, they're doing God's work, because it's God who sends us to hell, and it's God who, as it were, employs the devil and his demons to punish us. Just to mess that up a bit, after the end of the world, when God has finally defeated the devil himself and all his demons are sent to hell, and there they too will be punished. So in the long term, after the world ends, within traditional Christian thought, the devil and his demons are both the punishers and among the punished.
So we've talked about this in terms of the Christian tradition a lot, and I must be honest, I don't know a lot about the versions of hell and the devil in other cultures. Can you give us a little bit of either it's the same or it's different? I mean, I know like in Buddhism, for example, you're tempted by demons, when you're on the road to enlightenment, you're tempted by, things. But what about, can you give us any?
Look, I think simply put, within all the religious traditions, there are different personifications of evil, and they play much the same role. They're tempters, or they're the cause of evil in the world, or whatever. But essentially, there are personifications of evil in the other traditions. And Judaism and Islam both have their versions of the devil. Islam gets theirs essentially out of the Christian tradition, and the Christian tradition, in accord with Judaism, does its work on that stuff. The key thing, however, I think that is it's within the Christian tradition that the devil has come to play the most significant role within any of the religious traditions, because the whole of the history of the world, from creation to last things, is punctuated with the activities of the devil. He's really, it's the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and the devil as the key players in the history of Christianity.
So, we've been talking about this is all as history, like this is the historical view of God and a historical view of the devil. What about the modern view? I mean, we've talked about how religious thought just keeps on evolving to match our current worldview. What do you think's happening now in terms of
I think we'll take two streams, and we'll take two streams from, let's say, around about the year 1800. In one stream of conservative Christianity, the devil continues to play exactly the same role that he has always played, that he will be there to punish the damned in hell. So that's that mainstream tradition carrying on. But effectively, from the middle of the 19th century, within the West generally, and within liberal Christianity in particular, the idea of God's eternally punishing people in hell by the devil starts to fade away. And by the end of the 19th century, liberal Western Christians are getting pretty embarrassed about the idea of hell. And as the idea of hell drops out of the Christian tradition, so does the devil. Now that said, therefore, the modern secular notion of the afterlife, which is sort of spun out of liberal Christianity, has no devil and it has no hell. In a sense, all of us go off to, in the West, go off to some heavenly realm. Hell has basically disappeared from the intellectual framework of the secular West.
But then how does that manage the moral issues of crime and the 10 Commandments? I mean, if you kill someone, that's not a good thing, and but you're still allowed into heaven, or are you punished later at the end of time?
Essentially, the secular view of the afterlife has done two things. It's got rid of hell's punishments immediately after death, and the secular West no longer has any understanding of the end of the world coming, when God will intervene to wrap up the whole ball game and punish the wicked and reward the righteous.
Yeah.
So, the modern afterlife is a pretty universal affair where, everyone has run the race and all shall get prizes. More or less the same prize. We don't even have a notion that, if you've been wicked, you'll get some happiness but not complete happiness. So that's all disappeared. So we do have a kind of universalist tradition about the afterlife, which is a continuation of this one with no ethical judgment made at the point of death.
Wow, it's really fascinating, isn't it, how we look at it? I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who are from the Christian faith watching this and thinking, well, in my tradition, we do definitely have a hell. And so
absolutely.
We're talking very generally here, but I think it's really, really fascinating. So you've got these two books on the different, on good and evil. We've got Biography of God, Biography of the Devil, but you're working on a project now. Tell us about this new book.
Well, the new book's a history of the Antichrist, called The Antichrist, a new biography. So I'm really trying to trace the development of the idea of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist was essentially it was a failure within early Christian thought of what they expected to happen, i.e. the world did not end. So something had to be built into the system which went to explaining why evil continued and why the world didn't end. So there gets built into the history of Christian thought another character, a fully human character, the human being at his most wicked, who will take over the world before the end comes commit all sorts of evil deeds, the worst that any human being could ever do, before Christ finally intervenes and destroys the Antichrist and his forces. So the Antichrist then becomes a kind of, just as Christ was goodness incarnate, the Antichrist, Christ was the man who incarnated perfect goodness. So the Antichrist becomes, in the history of Christian thought, an oppositional figure, partly here already, but fully here in a man who will incarnate evil completely. So the Antichrist offers lots of opportunities for people to point the finger at some particular human individual. For radicals in the late medieval period, the Pope seemed to be a good person to point the finger at. If you were a Protestant, point the finger at the Pope and say, oh, well, the Antichrist has arrived. There he is. Yeah.
Could it be a woman?
Look, I can't think of... No. Because women could never be that evil, you say.
No, but honestly, what an interesting topic this must keep you awake.
It could be. I mean, one particular author said, well, it could be the Pope, because you never know what will happen with the papacy. Heretics become popes, it was said, and ordinary, everyday, uneducated laymen can become pope. And even, he said, we've already had a female pope, the infamous Pope Joan. So
when was that?
Oh, Pope Joan was a kind of imagined woman who became the Pope around about the year 900, somewhere around there. I forget the details now.
I didn't know that.
It's a good story. It's a good story.
There you go. You can do the biography of Joan. Pope Joan. There's a book there.
It's been done already, I feel. Anyway.
Wonderful. This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for fueling this, my curiosity and our curiosity about life after death and about the evolution of the way we think about it all. So I'd love to have you back with some more questions. By the way, if you're watching this and have questions for Philip, put them in the section below and comments, and we'll send them off to him and get some answers, because his mind is obviously fully capable of addressing them. So thank you so much, Philip, for your time and for your insights. It's been great.
Thank you very much, Margaret.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our Life After Death YouTube channel and visit our website at lifeafterdeath.com. We are a community of people who are fascinated by the topic of life after death and subjects like near-death experience, the afterlife, reincarnation, and spirituality. Together, we are exploring and discovering these topics together with curiosity and an open heart.